Morning. Oop, well, that's a little high, isn't it? Alright, we'll give that a try. That's a little bit better. I've actually got a backdrop coming that won't be just a white wall. Hopefully we can get some more stuff in this room hung up on the walls and knock down some of this echo. Running a little late this morning, but made it as always. Still doing the genealogy of Christ. We're going to talk about Seth today. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25 is the first mention of Seth. But before we get into that, we just need to keep praying for our nation, praying for the election results, praying for people with COVID-19. There was a young child that was injured in a Christmas parade nearby this past weekend and this weekend. And so keep praying for him. He is looking like he's slowly going to recover. But if I find an update on that, I'll post it to the group page. It's really sad when people get impatient and they begin to think about themselves. They become very selfish in those impatient moments. And unfortunately, that's how the young child was hurt. Somebody got very impatient in waiting for traffic to clear up and hit the kid trying to pick up candy on the side of sidewalk, side road, something of that nature. So just be in prayer for that young man, that he'll continue to recover. The last update I saw, he had some signs of being able to move his fingers and spoke and that kind of thing. So, God be with him for sure, as well as his family. And, anytime you have tragedy, you hope and pray that God's power and his mercy and his light shines through and somebody gets something from that situation that helps them either realize who God is, that he truly does care, or that somebody's reminded of that, just that God's will be done and his light and his glory shine through the situation. That's why, generally speaking, we as Christians have an easier time handling tough situations. It's not that we are just, impervious to that sort of thing. But there was a statistic that some Catholic group put out through all this COVID-19 ridiculousness and the lockdowns. The people who have the greatest mental health, so to speak, are the ones who actually go to church every week. So those of us who continue to go to church, and whatever that looks like for you, as long as you've kept your faith in God, but specifically those of us who've actually gone to church through this whole thing, we have fared better mentally than the ones who have not. And of course I'm sure that includes non-Christians as well, non-churchgoers, period. But those of us who've stayed faithful and kept going to church, we're doing better than the ones who aren't. So be praying for the folks out there that need to come back to church. And it's just a better, safer place, healthier place to be. So we're talking about the genealogy of Christ. And of course, last time we spoke about Adam and Eve, of course, at the very beginning, the first people. And, Adam lived 830 years total. 930 years. He lived, when he was 130, they had their child Seth. And then Adam lived another 800 years after that. So 930 years was Adam. I'm sure Eve was probably along for most of that. It doesn't really say. But, so like I said, Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, all right, so if we go into chapter 5, and let's see here. All right, chapter 5, verse 3 says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. And like I said, Adam lived 800 years after that, for 930, that's in verse 4. And of course, he had other sons and daughters. It's not real clear. I don't think this was the third child that they had. So Seth wasn't like the third born, because Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth, when Eve had Seth. And again, he was to replace Abel, who was killed by Cain. And there's not a whole lot to get into about Seth. There's really not much spoken of him other than him, where he is in the lineup, and that he is the one who picked up the bloodline to continue the bloodline all the way to Christ. And the reason he came about, and this is what you end up talking about when you get into Seth, is you end up talking about Cain and Abel. So Cain and Abel were the first two born. Cain was firstborn, Abel was second. And that goes back to chapter 4, the beginning of Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So, again, firstborn, secondborn, within 9 months of each other, basically, pretty close to, maybe a year. Cain was a farmer, Abel was a rancher, and when they brought an offering to the Lord, now, this is right after the garden, so they had been kicked out of the garden, and the first thing God had to do to cover their sin, i.e. their nakedness, was to sacrifice an animal. Now, it doesn't specify which animal. It just says that somewhere in chapter 3 it says that he made a covering for them. So we don't know if it was goats, we don't know if it was cows, bulls, lions. We don't know what was sacrificed in order for them to have covering. So blood had to be shed for the remission of sins. That's very, that's what we learn in the New Testament. Christ's blood had to be shed for us. That's why we say that that's the beginning of the scarlet thread of redemption, right? So here's Cain and Abel bringing offerings to the Lord, and the example set is an animal sacrifice, which is why God preferred Abel's offering over Cain's offering. It was not a blood sacrifice. It was offering of the fruit of the ground. And if you continue on and you read, especially once you get up to when Solomon did the temple and the way they set things up for the Levites, grain offerings, or fruit of the ground, so to speak, grain offerings were basically there to maintain the priests, the Levites. The animal sacrifices were for God. Not to say they couldn't eat any meat, but animal sacrifices were meant for God. There were grain sacrifices that came along later, but again, they don't have near the value because there's no bloodshed in harvesting a field. Now, obviously, you might scratch your fingers or something, but that's not truly shedding blood to please God. And so that is why God didn't like Cain's offering as much as he liked Abel's offering. And so verse 6, and this really is kind of the crux of the whole thing. God himself is really paying attention. God himself is going to speak directly to Cain. Verse 6, chapter 4, verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? Verse 7, and this is the one I made the meme of and shared this morning. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. So God's looking down on the earth. This is God. God is omnipotent. He knows everything, and he's the same in the past, the present, and the future, right? So he's sitting up in heaven, outside of space and time, and he's able to look at what's going to happen, what is happening, and what's going to happen. It's kind of like watching a movie and hitting fast forward or rewind. You know, maybe you've watched the movie several times, and so you know what the next scene is. But God is looking at Cain, and he's telling him, he's giving him a chance here to correct himself. I see what's in your head. I see what's going on. Don't do what you're about to do. You need to correct yourself. This is not, sin's crouching at your doorstep. And, so Cain didn't listen. Verse 8, Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So, guns aren't the problem. People are, and it doesn't specify what Cain used to kill Abel. He could have used a rock, could have used his bare hands, could have used a bow and arrow. Who knows? It's really unknown. Just the simple fact, it doesn't matter what the tools are. It doesn't matter what the weapon is. It matters what's in your mind. Gun sits on the table all day long, kills nobody until a person picks it up and pulls the trigger. And it's because we're not ruling over sin. We're not stopping ourselves. We're not learning from our mistakes. Cain got jealous. Instead of going, okay, God, well, what do I need to do better? He just was still upset with Abel. Now, again, Cain's firstborn, Abel's secondborn. So Abel really has no birthright here. But because Cain is choosing to sin, he's giving up his birthright. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, and it's the same thing he did in the garden. God knew exactly what happened. He knew exactly where Abel was. And he knew that his blood was shed. But he's giving Cain a chance to ask for forgiveness. And just like his father Adam and his mother Eve, he doesn't ask for forgiveness. I don't really see where Adam nor Eve asked for forgiveness from the Lord. Go back and reread it if you want to in chapter 3. But they don't. They keep wanting to blame somebody else. Eve blames the serpent. Adam blames Eve. Nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions. So here's Cain, doesn't want to take responsibility for his actions. And so then the Lord said to Cain, verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And of course, now that, this is, God curses Cain, and he's going to be a wanderer, nomadic people, a tent people. And, there's problems with his descendants further on down the line that the Israelites run into. But it's interesting. Because you get to verse 13, and this is what I'm talking about, not taking responsibility for your own actions. Now you get to verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So he doesn't really, the implication here is he doesn't really care that he killed his brother, and he's not sorrowful that he did it. It's, my punishment is more than I can bear. You know, when we're going to be punished for what we've done wrong, most of us out there, a great many of us, want the least amount of punishment possible. We want to be treated with mercy, so to speak, yet we showed no mercy for the person we wronged. And Cain is asking for mercy when truthfully he doesn't deserve it. So God does grant him mercy. And let's see, verse 15, then the Lord said to him, not so, if anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So, despite the fact that Cain did not ask for forgiveness, I mean, that's what I'm reading in this. Read it for yourself. And, if you got an issue with that, let me know. We'll talk about it. But I'm not reading anywhere where Cain says, Lord, forgive me for what I just did. He complains about his punishment rather than accepting responsibility for his own actions. I mean, does that not sound familiar today? Do we not have people running around saying, well, I shouldn't have to go to prison for 50 years for killing those people. That's horrible punishment for me. What about the person who's dead? What do they get? Where's their justice? What's going on here? So we are still today, 5,600 plus years, 5,700 years later, we are still doing the same thing that Cain did in response to God punishing him for his actions. And of course, we know the curse of sin is death. And that's the only way to pay for sin. So, his payment is being put on hold. So he doesn't have to make the payment right there on the spot. It's being saved up to be paid for later on down the road. Now, I couldn't tell you if Cain's going to be in heaven or not. I have no idea. Abel, I'm quite sure is. And that will be an interesting person to meet and talk to. But, again, going back to Seth, right, the next person in the lineage of Christ. So Cain essentially gave up his birthright when he committed the sin, didn't ask for forgiveness, and he was cursed by God and set to wander all over the place. Despite his protection, God is protecting Cain so that Abel's brothers and sisters don't go and attack him for killing his brother, to seek revenge or to seek punishment. So, and again, when Adam had lived 130 years, he and Eve bore Seth. So, now exactly how old, Cain and Abel were at least 130 years old at this point. It's really hard to tell. Obviously, Abel didn't live past 130 years. And again, Cain was supposed to have been the successor. His bloodline would have led to Christ, but he committed sin and did not seek forgiveness. So God turned around and made sure that a new individual, because there was other brothers and sisters to choose from. There was other children that they could choose from, that God could choose from. It would have fallen to the third born, son, and we're not given that indication. It could be possible that Seth really is the third born, but because it doesn't really say they had a bunch of other kids, they just said they had the first two, and then it jumps over to Seth, and then after Seth, God had more. Adam and Eve had more sons and daughters after Seth. So, maybe he is the third born, maybe not. All we know is that Seth is the replacement for not necessarily Cain. He's not necessarily Abel. He's not the replacement necessarily for Abel. He is the replacement for Cain in the bloodline. And so Seth lived 105 years, fathered Enosh. That's verse 6 in chapter 5. And then he lived another 807 years and had other sons and daughters. So, it's possible that they were waiting 100 years to have kids. I don't see that. But especially when the order is to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. But like I said, there's not a lot to be said about Seth other than to figure out where he came from. And the reason he's there, the reason he's mentioned is because he gets put in the lineage of Christ, because he is the replacement for Cain, because Cain gave up his birthright when he sinned and did not repent of it. So, and then Seth, let's say he fathered, verse 6, he was 105 when he fathered Enosh. And of course, Enosh is the next in line, so perhaps that is his firstborn, might just be his firstborn son. And then he lived another 807 years and had other sons and daughters. So altogether, Seth lived 912 years and he died, verse 8 in chapter 5. Now, the next several people here, Adam and Eve, and then Seth, and then we have Enosh. Let's see here. When Enosh had lived, verse 9 in chapter 5, when Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years and he died. So again, Adam and Eve, you have up to 130 years when Seth is born. So that's 130 years from the garden. And I mentioned last time in the chart that I posted that gives a good visual of the lineage going from Adam down to Seth and so on down the line. That individual seemed to think that the time in the garden was eternal, and that's just not true. It's not accurate. We were given the measure of time in Genesis chapter 1 for God. His measure of time was darkness, and then light is one day. Now, we figured out in modern times that one day is 24 hours. That's what we've assigned to it. But technically, by God's timekeeping, darkness and then light is one day. We don't have 12 solid hours of darkness, and we don't have 12 solid hours of light. Now, maybe that's because of the fall and the corruption of the earth in the process. Who knows? But God measures time, darkness, and then light is one day. So we have 6 days in the garden. We're not really given exact time frame from the time that Eve was created to when they had the fall, when they committed the first sin, which was to eat of the tree of knowledge, which is the only tree in the garden that God said not to eat from. We're not really given that measure of time, so it's kind of iffy. But even if you were to say that it was only a few days, Adam was created on the 6th day. Eve was clearly not created on the 6th day. She was created, several days after that, maybe on the 8th day, maybe on the 12th day, because Adam had to go through naming all the animals and all the different types of animals, which is another discussion in and of itself. But, so I'm saying all that to say this: Seth is at 130 years. So we're not more than 135 years from the beginning of time. And again, time only exists because you have something to measure it against. And the ultimate measure, as I said, is darkness and the light is one day. So that's when time began. So in Genesis, when, in the first day was when time began, when God created darkness and then light. It was darkness first, and then he put the light in there. And so, not to mention the fact that, when I'm 44 years old, my birthday's in August. I'm not sitting here telling you I'm 44 years in August, and 4 months and 20 days old. We don't do that. We say 44 years. So, exactly what point at 130 years did they have Seth? Was it exactly at 130? Was it at 130 years and 6 months? Inconsequential, but that's how we consider time. That's how we look at time. And that's how we look at age. So we've got 130 years from Adam to Seth. Then we have 105 years from Seth to Enosh. So we're up to 235 years. And then when Enosh had lived 90 years, so we're up to 325 years when Enosh fathered Kenan. And then, let's see here. Okay, when Kenan lived 70 years, so 325 years, so up to 395 years, when Kenan fathered Mahalalel. Let's see here. And then Kenan lived 910 years. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, if you notice, the time spans are getting shorter and shorter here when they're having their children. They're still living longer, but they're having them a little bit quicker. It does kind of go up and down a little bit, and eventually, though, it gets, we're sitting here at this point where we're lucky if somebody lives to be 80, which is better than it was so many years ago when people didn't live past 50. So, we kind of go up and down, but we're not getting anywhere close to the 930 years, or as far as Methuselah goes, 969 years. Let's see here. And then we get up to Jared in chapter 5, verse 16. So when Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. So we're not quite at 500 years yet. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. So when Jared was 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Now, I'm jumping ahead of all that because there's really nothing said of Enosh or Kenan, which can also be called Canaan. It depends on which translation you're looking at, who wrote the name. So Kenan is interchangeable with Canaan. And if you get further into, when you look at the genealogies, like with Luke's genealogy, he's mentioned, and then you get into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. When you look at these other genealogies, when you look at Samuel's and different stuff like that, there's certain people that aren't mentioned. And it's entirely possible that that's because of the Sanhedrin not wanting to legitimize Christ. Now, Christ's claim on the throne comes from David. His claim as a direct descendant from Adam, as the son of Adam, is brought into question. They do mess with ages and things because, again, the Sanhedrin didn't want to admit Christ was the Messiah, so they did everything they could to discredit him, which meant including changing their own history. If you ever get into this, reading the Septuagint has some variances from the Masoretic text, which is where we get the Old Testament and the King James Version and the English Standard Version. All your modern translations of the Bible use the Masoretic text, which came from the Sanhedrin, as opposed to the Septuagint. And the reason that's an issue is because Christ actually quotes from the Septuagint, and that was the so-called Bible they had when Christ was in ministry on earth walking around, was the Septuagint. But the next person that we'll get into is Enoch next week. Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24. He's a fun guy. But, again, I went through Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, and Jared because there's nothing spoken of them other than the fact that they're in the line, they're in the lineage of Christ. And there's not much to say about them because we're not given any information until we get to Enoch. So that's today's lesson. Again, Seth came about because Cain gave up his birthright by killing his brother and sinning against God and not repenting of it. So that's the takeaway from today. Appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.